Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of communication skills. Dear students, today I'm gonna deliver lecture number 16 and the topic for today's lecture is top-down, bottom-up listening strategies, and this lecture is the introduction of this discussion. Dear students, I am Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. So let's first of all look at the discussion agenda for this lecture. First of all, I will recap receptive skills of language learning, and after that we will discuss the factors that help listening. It will be followed by discussion on listening strategies that are basically classified into two types: top-down strategies and bottom-up strategies. Finally, I will conclude the lecture and give you a brief recap of the whole discussion. So that is the agenda for today's discussion. Starting with the receptive skills. Dear students, there are two receptive skills as we discussed in previous lectures. And the first one is reading and the second one is listening. Students, I will explain each of them to you to have a review of all these aspects of these receptive skills, so that we have clear idea before moving to the top-down and bottom-up strategies. As I told you earlier, that reading is basically a visual medium, and we have images when we are dealing with this very skill. It is basically an acquired skill or a learned skill, because we are being taught to learn this skill. And another important thing about this very skill is that it has a standard form, and most of the time written language is called the standardized language, because we see that written language has same spellings from beginning to the end, and all over the world we have same spellings, though there is evolution and some deviations, but these very deviations are very clear, and we know that these very spellings are British spellings or the other ones are American spellings. That distinction is very clear to us. Otherwise, there is standard form of the written material. Another way to express this very thing is that word boundaries are very clear in written language. Therefore, reading is very easy. It has a specific domain in which we can very easily progress. So written is a permanent stuff. That is another element of the reading skill, because we read the written material, and written material has permanent standard form. So comprehension can be recursive. It means that recursive is that thing which is relating to or involving the repeated application of rules or procedures to successive results, because we are repeatedly applying these rules and we are getting the same results. So that very thing is called recursive, and comprehension of a written material can be recursive. Now we will look at the second receptive skill, that is listening, and we see that it consists of different sounds. We hear different sounds, and most of the time this skill is naturally acquired or learned skill, and we see that most of the time this very skill is not being taught in the schools that much effectively as we study the reading skill or the writing skill. So listening skill is most often an ignored skill, but as modern day education systems are now including this skill in teaching in classrooms, and teachers are teaching this skill to the students, and now students are having a good and a very effective relation with this skill by understanding the basic concepts of this very receptive skill. As I told you that this skill is the skill most often we see that it is naturally acquired, but the most tricky thing is that we don't have a standard form of these very sounds, because most of the time we come across different accents, and especially when we listen the weak forms or connected forms or short forms, even the native speakers they pronounce these very words so diversely that it becomes very difficult for a foreigner speaker especially, and even for some of the native speakers to understand those blur word boundaries which is being created because of the different accents and weak forms or connected short forms. So these spoken words are ephemeral. It means that they are momentary and have the temporary effect, and we often see that even the single person pronounce the same word with different variations. So especially for the listeners there is a very high level of anxiety. So spoken language has very short life, or it has that temporary or momentary aspect, and often we see that very soon it creates or it elevates and increases the level of anxiety in the learners. Now let's see the chief elements that help listening, and there are two variations in this concept. The first one is that we have background knowledge. Often listeners have that backdrops. They have the information about the topic or the subject matter or the theme of the discussion, and often listener has the understanding of the field which is going to be discussed in that discussion, and the last is that they have the view of the whole environment or atmosphere of the discussion. So dear students, another way of looking at the factors or the elements that help listening is that we should have understanding, or we should have the awareness and comprehension of the sounds. The second thing is vocabulary, and the last but very important thing is the grammar or the set of the rules of that language. If we have that knowledge, both of these informations are very important. The first one is the background knowledge, and the second one is the knowledge of the language. So these two factors which have subdivisions, they help the listener for having better understanding or comprehension of any subject being discussed in any conversation. Now let's move towards the main theme of today's discussion, that is listening strategies. Dear students, listening strategies are those methods, procedures and practices, or these are those actions or activities, or even we can include the behaviors that adds directly to the understanding and conceptions and command, or bringing to mind or recalling of the listening input. So listening strategies include these techniques and activities. Another way to define the same thing is that listening strategies can be classified by those processes of the input and by which the listener gets that information or the data or awareness from the speaker. And we see that these approaches of listening are divided into two main categories. The first one is top-down strategy and the second one is bottom-up approach. So these two very strategies are the most important techniques or methods which are being followed in the listening approaches. So dear students, now look at the first one, the top-down strategy, and I will give you a brief overview of these two strategies. So let's define the top-down strategy. Definition of top-down strategy is that it is that processing strategy that stirs up or that evokes a very heavy stock of or that collection of previous information that we have in our mind or the listener has in his mind, and it is added by those global beliefs and expectations or anticipations that acts as the background of or the backdrop of information of that discussion. And we see that these three components they suggest or stir up and that listener bring all these things to the text. So in bottom-up processing strategies, we see that the prior information and those beliefs that humanity is having and other additional information that we are having, all these things are brought to the text for its interpretation. So another definition of top-down strategies is being given by Noonan, and we see that in the same way he defines top-down processing, that it is more concerned with the activation of schemata or design for deriving meanings, and we see that there are global understandings or collective understanding and interpretation of the text. So all these elements and factors have their role in the understanding of the text. With the help of that prior and previous knowledge, we have the understanding of the text. So the basic thing is that top-down strategies are listener-based strategies. It means that in this strategy that the focal person or the central person is the listener, and we see that listener opens or we see that the listener make use of or utilize the background knowledge of that very subject, and that background knowledge includes the situation or the state of affairs or the circumstances in which the things are happening, all these conditions. And the most important thing is the type of the text, that which style or which variety of the text or information they are providing us. And the last but not least, the most important factor is the language that is being used in that very conversation. That is very important for the listener. All these factors, including that background knowledge, we see that activates a number of expectations, and these expectations or anticipations that help the listener to interpret, or we see that it helps the listener to deduce different results, and it provides an opportunity to the listener to read between the lines. And it also helps the listener that he anticipate what will come next. So all these things are there for the listener in top-down strategies. Now we will look at that what are the most important components of top-down strategies, and these very components are being listed below. And the first one is listening for the main idea. Dear students, these are the concepts that the speaker wants the audience to remember, and it is the duty of the listener to listen for these very main ideas. Another thing is that he should predict, and predicting in listening means that the listener carry out an activity before listening to the text where they predict that what they are going to hear. So that totally depends upon the predictions. That in today's discussion, it might be that the speaker includes these very points in this discussion, and the listener is sitting there just to confirm that either the speaker is rejecting his predictions, or he is following the line which he has predicted. So predicting in listening means that the listener he listens as the speaker is confirming or rejecting his prediction. And the third component, that is again very close to predicting, but it is not the same thing or the similar thing. We see that drawing inferences is very different thing, because drawing inferences means that the listener listen all the clues and make his best guess. So inference is not similar to prediction. It is very different from making predictions, because in this very act the listener is using all the clues, all important main ideas to draw conclusions. So that is drawing inferences. And the last point, that is again very important point in top-down strategies, and that is summarizing. Basically, we are already aware of the concept of the summary, and summary is a concise overview of the most important points of that communication. So in this very act, the listener he just formulates a shorter version of the whole discussion, and in this way he draws a conclusion, and we see that he gets the understanding of the whole discussion. So that is top-down strategy. Now let's move towards the bottom-up strategies, and the definition of bottom-up process is that it refers to getting or deriving or drawing from or obtaining the meanings of the message, but that very meanings are based on the incoming language information or data. So it totally depends upon the received information that is being provided to the listener, and it does not have any relation with the background information or the context or situation of that very data, and it has very limited connection to the awareness of the type of the text, and it basically focus on the sounds from which we form the words. As we have already studied in the discriminative listening, we see that first of all, listener discriminates between different sounds, and out of these very sounds he just make words, and then he look at the word order or the patterns of on the grammatical relationship in those very words, and after that he derive or draw the meanings. It means that he starts the process of deriving meanings from the very basic level, and there is no role of the background information. So bottom-up processing is text-based. As we studied that top-down strategies are listener based. In the same way, we see that bottom up strategies are text based, and the listener rely on the language in the message, and that language is, we are very much aware, that is the combination of and that language is a mixture of sounds from which we derive words, and these very words are arranged in some order or pattern, and we have set of grammatical rules. And when we look at these very things, then we create meanings out of that very dialogue or communication. So bottom up strategies are text based, and the listener, he is totally dependent on the language in the message, and that language is amalgamation of sounds, words, and the most important thing is the grammar of that very language, and from that he creates the meaning. Now we will look at the most important elements or the factors of bottom up strategies, and bottom up strategies includes the following three important points. The first one is listening for specific details, and the second one is recognizing cognates, the words which are having same root words, and the last one is recognizing word order patterns, or those set of rules or the style which that language follows. So these are the three important things in bottom up strategies, and in bottom up strategies we see it is text based, and sounds, words, and grammar is the most important thing which we keep in our mind. So finally, now we are going to discuss the conclusion of the whole lecture. I will conclude the lecture in this way, that listening comprehension is not either top down or bottom up processing, but the end result is that it is an interactive. It means that both these very strategies influence one another, and we see that both of these are related to one another, and this process is very interactive. The second thing is that it is interpretative, because it is related to providing the interpretation. Therefore, listening comprehension is neither top down or bottom up process. It is a mixture of top down and bottom up processes, where we see that listeners are using both the prior knowledge and the linguistic elements. Prior knowledge includes the context, the situation in which the things are happening, and the context of that very thing. All these things, including predictions and inferences, all these things are included in the listening process. And it is not only the prior knowledge or the context, we also have a very keen observation about linguistic element of the language in the understanding of the message, because a listener has to pay attention to the sounds from which we form the words, and the grammatical rules and the order of the word in which the words are being placed in any situation. So that is the whole discussion for today's lecture. Dear students, now you will be having the better understanding of top-down and bottom-up listening strategies. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.